Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Just a rearrangement on the agenda, no real official changes. We'll move the Operations Committee up to the first committee to report out tonight. Other than that, I think we're ready to go, and I will ask the clerk to please call the roll.
Mr. Kelly? Present. Mr. McDonald? Present. Mr. Neighbors? Present. Mrs. Red? Present. Mr. Salgado? Present. Mr. Schultz? Here. Mr. Tassoni? Present. Mr. Webster? Here. Mr. Westcott? Present. Mr. Arena? Here. Mr. Billich? Here. Mr. Boomer? Here. Mr. Booker? Present. Mr. Butita? Here. Mrs. Crosby? Here. Mr. Fellers? Here. Mr. Fiducia? Here. Mr. Girl? Mrs. Gurl? Mr. Hoffman? 19 present, 1 absent.
Thank you, Clerk Gummow. With that, I'm going to ask Mr. Kelly to pinch hit for Mr. Hoffman tonight, and I'm going to ask everybody to stand for the invocation and the pledge. Mr. Kelly.
Holy Father, Mother God, we thank you for this day and the many blessings that we enjoy. We ask that you watch over everyone in the family and police department over in McHenry County. We ask that you watch over all of our first responders that serve in harm's way every day. We ask you to watch over us and guide us in our decision making. We ask all these things in your holy name. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the United States of America and to the republic. Justice for all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. With that, I will move on. We have no public comment this evening, so we can move into our number 7 meeting minutes. May I please have a motion to approve the minutes from February 14th and to lay over the minutes from February 28th. May I please have a motion? Thank you, Mr. Feller. Second by Mr. Billick and Mr. Boomer and Mrs. Crosby. Minutes are now before the board. Any discussion or questions by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Announcements and communications, Clerk Gummow.
The items below are listed and received as correspondence, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Clerk Gummow. We'll place those on file. Next item of business, board member correspondence. Any questions, comments by board members? I'm going to go to Mr. Booker first, and then I think Mr. McDonald. Mr. Booker.
In the newspaper the other day was yet another article where I'm learning of another attempt by board members, a 9th attempt or so, to remove or alter responsibilities, duties of the county board chairman that has been elected by the citizens of Winnebago County. I've yet to see evidence or hear any discussion where the chairman has violated any policies or is suspected of any wrongdoing. If any board member has any factual knowledge, any factual evidence of any policy violations or wrongdoing, it's my belief that it be brought up in discussion at caucus, not in secret phone calls, secret emails. This is a disservice to the citizens of Winnebago County and to the Winnebago County Board. What I find extremely troubling is that it appears that the focus has shifted from the real issues, such as River Bluff, budget constraints of the Sheriff's Department, the State's Attorney's Office, the Public Defender's Office, economic development. Recently, a collaborative effort was successful in putting together a 911 agreement. During this time, it seems that individuals have had their own agenda of having their meetings where the discussion involves changing responsibilities of the county board chairman. I find that troubling. I'm recommending that any ordinance change go through the operations committee. This past Monday night, at caucus, there was supposed to be discussion on ordinance change, and it was canceled, and now it's being brought up again. And again, I'm not involved in any discussion. I have no idea what the basis for any of this is. So I recommend that board members, before they're duped into any rumors or personality conflicts, take a long, hard look at any ordinance change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. March 20th at Harlem High School in the auditorium, there's going to be a town hall forum regarding the river and the operation of the dam. The National Weather Service will be there, the Sheriff's Department will be there, ComEd will be there to let everybody know how things are changing, how the operation of the dam is working. As you know, right now, the river's going up and is expected to go much higher. So anybody whose district touches the river, I would encourage you to be there and let anybody in the public know that next, what does that be, Wednesday, the 20th at 6 p.m. at the Harlem High School auditorium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to notify the board, in the Public Safety Committee, we had some conversations about the staffing levels at the Sheriff's Department. That conversation began when the sheriff invited me to talk about his budget, and I started asking questions, and we realized that we didn't have a consensus on what the proper staffing levels are, both for patrol and for the jail staff. The sheriff had provided some information on the patrol numbers, and Carla had been involved in that, and she was going to have professional staff connect with the sheriff to see if we could come to an agreement on target numbers. I realize that just because we come up with a number doesn't mean we have the funds for it, but thinking more for conversation purposes and a better understanding. Carla, have they made connection yet, the Sheriff's Department, with your office?
Carla.
Yeah, we received the information that Mr. Carner provided, and we're doing some research. We're in the middle of that.
Okay, thank you. Then the second level of that was the staffing at the jail. Chairman Haney had suggested to me that before we go through a process of seeking out, the patrol stuff can happen internally at no cost, but it appears that we may need to incur an expense to get an accurate assessment of what a proper staffing is for the jail. And so before we go through that process, the chairman suggested I mention this to the board and find out if the board has an interest in us pursuing that. At this point, it would just be to determine what it would cost us to get that study done, not actually do the study. I don't know if what the proper procedure is to get that input from board members.
Sure.
Chairman.
Well, yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Arena. I think that it would be a great discussion item, and I appreciate you bringing it up to the whole board if we had a discussion in public safety and see if there's some interest at the public safety level, and then we can go from there. That way we cover both bases with a more robust discussion at the committee level. That would give Carla a little time and staff a little bit of time. We could do that in the very near future and then be ready to see where the board wants to go. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Arena. Any other discussion, comments by board members? Seeing none, I'll move on to the chairman's report. There's a document in front of you, working project list. This is not something I'm going to go over in great detail, but I'm just going to ask you to indulge me to allow me to share 4 or 5 items with you, just so they're on the radar of everybody. What is laid out here, and I put a note at the top, this is not a complete list, nor is it an attempt to take credit for all the hard work of many of our staff and employees and partners and such, but this is just kind of a dashboard of things I'm kind of keeping tabs on that I think are of interest to the community and also to our board and our committees. The first is a number of issues under community and neighborhood revitalization. The second is economic development, and we're not going to talk about the past, we'll talk about the future. The RADC has a study on workforce where they've been talking to a number of employers in the region over the last several months. I think that's a critically important study to drive educational programming around Barbara Coleman and their Advanced Technology Center, of which the county is a big partner with the city in Rock Valley. That report should be coming out. We'll ask Mr. Bryant to come and talk in great detail, perhaps in Mr. Westcott's committee and/or to the full board. We want our employers driving educational programming, so we're meeting their needs, and then we're aligning our population with the jobs of the future, not of the past. So very excited about that. When we move on here, there's a number of issues under 3, planning and policy reform. If you want to talk about any of these offline or in committee, I think they're great discussion topics. I really appreciate Carlin opening up in her county administrator's report to have Tiana just give a high-level overview of the shared values and a high level on the strategic plan here shortly. So I'll move on from that. When we flip the page here, go down to number 8 if you don't mind. There's 2 things I just want to point out that I'm interested in. One is that I talked to Representative Sam Yingling, who is a very successful legislator in the suburbs today, and he is bringing forward comprehensive legislation related to the position of chairman in the state of Illinois. There's 102 counties, there's 102 chairmen. What we're finding in Winnebago County may be a prime example, but it is not the only example of counties that are not benefiting from the very opaque, unclear language in the state statute around the role of chairman. And one of the things Sam wants to do is bring forward legislation in Springfield that would set out a more broad duties list for county board chairmen, whether elected from within a board or elected at large countywide, as many of the counties, larger metro counties, have an elected chairman countywide. Regardless, setting forth some duties and having some comprehensive legislation around that, I thought it was a very interesting discussion. One of the things he noted to me, and I'm sure will become a matter of state discussion more broadly than Winnebago County, is that in the absence of more clarity, the idea that maybe we've attempted to overchange one particular ordinance or part of it, I think has at times caused dysfunction, division among otherwise people who might work better together, and I think it has made things much more difficult. The second thing I wanted to mention was the idea that I'm hearing a lot in the community is the idea around a referendum where the community would speak and weigh in like they did in McHenry County and almost every other county where there is a countywide elected chairman, whether or not they'd want to see the voters have input in an election cycle or in a ballot question around the permanency of the chairman position and what that may or may not look like in the future. I'm not here to say there's a right or wrong way. What I am saying is that I'm interested in the discussion. I'm getting a lot of calls, and over the next few months, there's nothing immediate. There's no immediate opportunity at a ballot question. It would probably be in the 2020 cycle. So we got time to look at that and what that may or may not be, but the idea of getting community feedback may be something we'd want to consider. The next item I had for you in the last, if you go to the third page, is just more immediate items around agenda transparency, number 12. This is something that I think is really important, is that I'm just asking our committee chairs to work with our staff. There is committee chairs by our board rules that are adopted, can bring forward pretty much any item they want at their discretion as committee chair. The one thing I'd ask is that we make a commitment so that I'm not getting calls on Friday afternoon by grouchy folks in the community or media around items on an agenda that they can't understand or other board members can't understand. So my point is, if we are amending a part of a code on an agenda, Chapter 2, amending Chapter 2 or sections of Chapter 2 of the Winnebago County Code, that is absolutely at the discretion of any committee chairman. I think that's an okay conversation, but let's have a description so that we understand, our community understands, our media understands, and our other board members understand what is in fact going to be going to the committee. I want to thank the state's attorney. She is going to be given an update on OMA at our next board meeting, not in April, but at our next board meeting. So thank you, State's Attorney Hart Ross, on making yourself available for that. The next thing I just want to put out there that this has been an on-again, off-again discussion. For some of the board members that are holdover board members, we've talked in the past about our voting rules. The majority of the votes you all take just require a simple majority. but there's a few of our votes, like suspending the rules, calling the question, and of course, budget amendments, and they require more than a majority of vote, but it's not a consistent number of votes. So then we're turning to our parliamentarian or to our attorney, say, well, is it 12 votes, 13 votes based on who's here? Or in the case of a budget amendment, it's a supermajority of the members of our board, which is 14, no matter who all is here. One of the things I'd like to bring forward, unless there's great objection, is just the idea of a discussion, maybe an operations committee. Would it be okay, and something the board's comfortable with, if we got uniform in these kind of non-majority votes, you know, suspending the rules, calling the question, make it in line with our budget amendment. So everything that isn't a majority vote would be a supermajority vote of our board of 14 votes. That way we don't have to stop the meeting and double check if we got the right number of votes to do something. There's clarity by the board member bringing forward a motion. There's clarity on the people voting, and it just keeps the flow of things going. The last thing, and then I'll move on, is this is something I talked about and then was remiss on formalizing. There's 3 members of the county board who serve on the University of Illinois Extension Board. That is an organization doing great work around workforce development and a number of other initiatives. We also fund it through host fees. We get 3 appointments. Because of a board changeover, we intended to get Mr. Booker on there officially. Mrs. Gorel and Mr. Webster have served on that for some time and will remain as board members, but we want to bring forward in the next board meeting the appointment of Mr. Booker out of District 1, serves a rural part of our county. I think would be a great addition to that particular board going forward. So that's just something on the horizon as well. We do have a number of board liaison positions that'll be coming forward in the next board meeting or 2. So with that, I'm going to conclude the chairman's report, and we're going to move to the county administrator's report, and I'll go to Carla. Carla, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to be very brief because Tiana's going to talk a little bit on our shared values. River Bluff had their annual survey, and we got the final report this week. We had a lot of improvement. Last year we had 9 deficiencies, and this year we're down to 3. So I think we're making great progress in a lot of areas. Currently, we're working with the Sheriff's Department on a few things. You'll see the McChesney Park IGA for policing services coming forward soon. We have an emergency management IGA with the city that will be coming forward. Mr. Karner and I are meeting with Mr. Bergstrom from the city to review that and kind of hammer out that the cost piece of that's correct. And then our emergency notification system is coming into life. That's included in your capital plan that I provided you last week. We're going to meet with the city. Gus, our CIO, and Mr. Karner will be meeting with the city to see if there's something we can do jointly to send out those emergency notices. We're concluding our work on the Wellness Center RFP, and we plan to bring a recommendation next week to committee. Ann's doing the final work to get the best cost for us as possible, but we're really pleased with how the process went, and the recommendation we'll be bringing forward to you. Animal Services, we had another meeting with the not-for-profit rescues last week. I think it was a good meeting. We're all on board with working together to make sure that we're serving the community as best as we can with the resources and the strengths that we each have. You'll see some ordinance changes coming forward to help the trap neuter release program that basically will control the population of cats that live in the community. And then we've been asked to go ahead and develop an intergovernmental agreement with the city for animal services, so hopefully we're coming close to a conclusion on that process. The state's attorney, the chairman, auditor, and myself met regarding the recorder automation fund. We're going to make some changes in the accounting structure of that to make sure that fees and fees are going to the right fund. There'll be some changes to the general fund, some changes to the recorder automation fund, and then we'll be establishing a county automation fund that'll help us fund some of our IT needs that were included in that capital plan. Regarding economic development, Chris and I have been meeting. We had a meeting today and plan on having another on Monday. We're developing a process for incentive requests that come from development. We're also developing a process for the annual host fee awards. And then we've been working on the economic development policy. We'll have a draft that we'll present to our internal committee on Tuesday, March 19th, and then we plan on having an economic development meeting to discuss those, not to take any action, but just to discuss and get further input. And then last week, I presented a 2-year capital plan. I'll be reaching out to the different departments to expand that to a 5-year plan. And we'll continue to have discussions as to how we can fund that plan. And then I'll turn it over to Tiana.
Carla, just a quick follow-up, and then we'll go right to Tiana. On the recorder automation fund and then the split with the county automation fund, and if I missed it, I apologize, the dollar amounts, ballpark, that'll be split?
Ballpark, about $500,000 will shift over to the county automation fund initially. The auditor recommended a 50-50 split, and the recorder agreed to that.
So we'll realize a little bit of money into our budget. Thank you very much, Carla. Tiana?
Good evening, everyone. The county board gathered in 2018 to explore and discuss the future, share a vision for the community, and establish new goals for Winnebago County. And the results of that process are the 5 shared organizational values and the 5 strategic priority areas. I've placed on the county board members' desks the executive summary that was completed from that process. So the 5 shared values are communication, respect, collaboration, accountability, and leadership. So the values guide the perspective of the organization as well as its actions. So they form an ethical foundation for the organization, okay? Organizational values drive our everyday behaviors, decision-making, interpersonal interactions, prioritization, and recognition. The 5 strategic priority areas are the financial stability and stewardship, organizational efficiency and collaboration, community health and public safety effectiveness, 21st century infrastructure, dynamic economic development. So when the board met in 2018 to discuss these things, they were asked a few questions such as, for Winnebago County, you envision a future in which, county leadership is unified and engaged with its residents. That residents have an increased sense of security in the community, diversity and inclusion of all residents is a high priority, affordable housing is available to all, amenities and infrastructure are maintained and updated. When they were asked what Winnebago County is, people made comments such as, it's a great place to raise a family, a caring, faith-based community, progressive with a lot of potential, strategically located, and it's diverse and supportive of its community. What does Winnebago County have to offer? Diverse, high-quality employment opportunities, excellent public recreation and park district, an active community and social service organizations, numerous amenities at an affordable cost of living, and a mix of rural location and urban development. So what should Winnebago County as a whole strive for? Having a variety of dining and entertainment options, improving community perceptions and changing the narrative, providing high-quality rehabilitation and mental health services to residents, increasing services provided for youth and seniors, all age spectrum planning, improving employee retention and recognition. So Winnebago County's future expectations and priorities are to improve collaboration and communication within the county's board, follow through and have a move forward mindset, provide residents with an increased sense of security in the community, diversify revenue and funding sources, encourage more citizen engagement. I just want to go over the first 2 sentences again that I did before I wrap it up, just to kind of get remind everybody what the true focus of the shared values and the five strategic priority areas, okay? Values guide the perspective of the organization as well as its actions. They form an ethical foundation for the organization. Organizational values drive our everyday behaviors, decision-making, interpersonal interactions, prioritization, and recognition. The next steps from this is going to be presented at the Operations Committee. If approved, then it will be brought to the board to be adopted as a board. Then we're going to roll out with countywide branding. We're going to have an administrative launch of a lead by example commitment to organizational values with supporting the purpose, descriptions, and exemplary behaviors. We're going to conduct employee engagement survey to gain employee output and understand the discrepancies between the current and future state. Develop a strategy for deployment based of an employment engagement responses and suggestions, and we want to embed into performance measurements, processes, and operations. And that's it. Anybody have any questions or anything regarding these?
Any
I'm sorry,
questions
you're
for
supposed to do that.
Tiana? Comments? Very good. Thank you very much, Tiana, and thank you,
Thank you.
Carla. Our next item of business is the approval of the consent agenda. May I please have a motion to approve the consent agenda, which includes the raffle report? Thank you, Mr. Boomer, on the motion, second by Mr. Billick. Thank you. Item is now before the board. Any discussions on the consent agenda? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Are you sure? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Next item of business, standing committee reports. I'm going to go first to the Operations Committee. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Operations Committee has two resolutions before you this evening. The first resolution is to terminate lease agreement with the City of Rockford for the Public Safety Building, and I move for his approval.
We got a motion by Mr. McDonald on item, the first item on the termination of the lease agreement with the City of Rockford regarding the PSB. May I have a second, please? I have several seconds. Mr. Westcott, thank you. Mr. Neighbors, Mrs. Crosby, and I think I saw a hand up, Mr. Tassoni. The item is now before the board. Any questions or comments by board members? Seeing none, I would just note for the record, and I want to thank staff. I believe Carla made a call, and we've aligned, so the City of Rockford obviously knows this discussion is coming. They were comfortable with it, and they're working through their timeline, so no surprises to our partners. So thank you, Carla, on that. Any other discussion or comments by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second resolution appointing Gary Anderson to the Board of Trustees of the Northern Illinois Land Bank Authority, and I motion
We got a motion by Mr. McDonald and the resolution appointing Gary Anderson to the Board of Trustees of the Northern Illinois Land Bank Authority. May I have a second? I see a few hands up. Mr. Booker, Mr. Fellers, I think Mr. Billick had his hand up. Thank you. Item is now before the board for
Mr. Chairman, may I interject?
discussion.
I'd like to defer, we amended this in committee.
Yep.
And does council, should I read the amendments now? Thank you very much. I apologize
Mr.
for
McDonald.
that. So the amendment to the resolution after the fourth paragraph, it goes, the county board shall have the authority to remove its trustee upon the majority vote of the board at any time during the term of the trustee is serving. Upon that vote, the county board chairman shall bring forth a replacement to be voted on by the board by resolution. Upon confirmation by the board, the trustee shall serve the remainder of that term of the trustee who is removed. The trustee shall report to the county board or to a board committee designated by the board at least quarterly on the business conducted by the land bank. And then the last paragraph that will be added, trustees shall be excused from a vote due to conflict of interest as defined in 50 ILCS 105/3. A conflict of interest to require abstention must involve a direct personal or financial interest in the issue being voted upon.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDonald. So that's been read in for the record. Any questions or comments by board members? Yes, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say I'm going to be voting in favor of Mr. Anderson's appointment. I thought in committee he said the things I wanted to hear. In particular, he said that he was going to be there as our representative, protecting the interests of the county. And secondly, and something I was very concerned about, that he saw the land bank's purpose as being to get the properties into the hands of private parties as fast as possible. And back on the tax rolls, I was, concerned that the land bank could get bogged down in trying to focus on redevelopment rather than just moving the property along. I think that it's now important for us to get going on this and have the policies that we talked about needing to be amended, taken care of. I feel, I don't know if all of you had seen in the news, I think Steve Stottleman had a press release, Senator Stottleman, about legislation he has related to the county code and how it reacts with this land bank. That's work that's being done by the city of Rockford with Senator Stottleman. I had talked to our state's attorney about it, and it appeared that they hadn't really weighed in on it. I feel like we're along for the ride and somebody else is driving on this thing. I want to make sure that we are engaged early and take control of our destiny. So I think Mr. Anderson will be a good appointment, and he has committed to protect our interests. Thank you.
Any other discussion or comments by board members? Yes, sir. Mr. Billick.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with what Paul Arena has said, actually, and going through with this, one of the biggest things as far as this land bank goes is want to make sure that we actually have the best interest of the community, as the forefront to making this decision on who we appoint to this. One of the biggest things that Mr. Anderson has done is he is very involved, has always been involved with the community, and has a number of different areas that he has his expertise on as far as blighted communities. So he's a very strong candidate. I'm glad he actually got the appointment for it. However, at the same time, I always find that I need to make sure that I do my homework on who we give this possible job to. This is an important board to be on. I know that some people have made comments as far as, well, it's not going to be that effective within the first year, and I, however, disagree with that. I think it's going to be very effective. I think that this is one of the things that this county board has actually been talking about before I even got on here, which was to address these issues of blight. And the land bank itself is actually a strong position for someone to have, because it does address these properties and properties within these areas. Mr. Anderson is actually very involved with a lot of these areas, and I know that he's involved with a lot of groups that effectively deal with these properties. I'm happy that Mr. Arena and the other board members with the Operations Committee have actually addressed to make sure that we hold anybody that we put on this appointment accountable, as much as we all are held accountable on this board. So I do support Gary Anderson, because I do think that based on his knowledge, his experience with dealing with the blighted areas, I think that he will do a wonderful job. I just want to make sure that that's noted, because I know that I did have hesitation, because I want to make sure that everybody understands that who we appoint on this board is important, and somebody who has involvement with these areas, we want to make sure that we vet that, because this is somebody that we are going to vote on, and we want to make sure that to the people, to the voters and to the residents of our community, that they know that we didn't put somebody in from a special interest group, but somebody that was actually, whose only special interest is to promote the benefit of the whole region as a region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Billick. Any other questions, comments by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? I see a hand up by Mrs. Gorel, Mr. Tassoni, and Mr. We'll go ahead, I believe I have the vote count correct, but we'll go ahead at Mrs. Red's request, and we'll have a roll call. Roll call, Clerk Gamel.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors? Mrs. Red? Mr. Salgado? Mr. Schultz? Mr. Tassoni? Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott? Mr. Arena? Mr. Billich? Mr. Boomer? Mr. Booker? Mr. Butita? Mrs. Crosby? Mr. Fellers? Mr. Fiducia? Mr. Gurl? Mrs. Gorel? And Mr. Hoffman is absent. Mr. Kelly? That's 13 to 5. Oh, I'm sorry. Mrs. Red? We passed on you. I apologize. And Mrs. Red. That's a 6 to 13. Me.
Motion passes. Thank you very much. We have a land bank trustee, and it's Mr. Anderson. Thank you very much for the discussion. Mr. McDonald.
That concludes the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Next item of business, Finance Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance Committee has one item tonight, a budget amendment, 2019-019 Starcom to be laid over.
Thank you very much. We've read that in. Thank you, Mr. Salgado.
I'd like to move to suspend the rules and take a vote on this tonight.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado to suspend the rules, which would allow us to vote this evening. Motion by Mr. Salgado to suspend. I have a second by Mr. Westcott and Mr. Gurl. The item before the board is suspension of the rules. Any questions on suspending the rules? All those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye. Are there any opposed? Nobody's opposed. We've suspended the rules. I'll go back to Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move to approve Budget Amendment 2019-019 Starcom, and I'd like to speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Motion by Mr. Salgado to approve Budget Amendment 2019-019, the Starcom radio budget amendment. May I have a second? Mr. Neighbors, thank you very much. Item is now before the board, and I'm going to go to Mr. Salgado to speak to the issue.
Yes, so there was some good discussion on this, Starcom, obviously. This is a budget amendment of $127,155 due to some issues with funding that were lost with the city of Rockford. And so this is a budget amendment. We're obligated to pay a $200,000 payment on an annual basis. And so this is just to recover some of those funds which equate to $127,000. So I just wanted to give a little bit of information on that. And then going forward, so we don't see this issue come up again from year to year, is we're going to plan that and budget that in the fiscal years to come. So unless anybody has any other questions, yes.
Mr. Fellers. Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question, the $127,000, was that all due to a grant, or was only part of that due to a loss?
As part of the grant.
How much of that was the grant?
$65,000, I believe, Carla, is that correct? That was lost.
And why, again, wasn't the other $65,000 budgeted for?
That is a good question. Carla, is there?
Part of the funding was supposed to come from the sheriff's department, and then there was other items that would be through savings on phone lines, which really wasn't identified to a specific budget.
Mr. Fellers.
Was there a line item in the sheriff's budget for these radios?
It was supposed to be a replacement of maintenance costs in the previous system. But then there was, when the agreement was entered into, there was a year where no payments were due. So I believe then some of those budget dollars were then shifted to other services.
Thank you, Carla. A follow-up, Mr. Fellers, or are you good? Mr. Fellers, okay. Mr. Butita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll go ahead and support this amendment, but I would like the administration to look into the status of these units. It's my understanding that there were over 400 of these units purchased. I asked a committee, the Sheriff's Department, how many they use, and they just got back to me a few days ago. They use 100 of them in their patrol division and 103 in their corrections department. So I'd like to know what the status is of the other, almost more than 50% of those units. Who has them, what's their status, and do we have any options of selling them, renegotiating? But what's the efficiency of these units that we're using? So I'll support the unit, but I would like to see some more information on this.
So the request by Mr. Butita, thank you, is an overview of which departments have Starcom radios so that there's a clear understanding of that and any potential options, if any, in terms of go forward. So thank you, Mr. Butita. We'll ask staff to get to that. I'm going to go to Mrs. Gorel the first time before I go back to Mr. Fellers a second. Mrs. Gorel.
My question is, thank you, Chairman. My question is, for corrections, isn't it mostly Rockford people that we have in corrections? Why are they backing out and we're getting stuck with their bill? Why are they not supporting the people that they have in corrections for these units?
I'm going to go to Carla on that one, just so I understand the question here. Carla?
None of these are for the city. What related to the city was we used to get a grant jointly with the city, and that funding is no longer available, but it was figured into how this was going to be paid for.
Just to follow up on it, are we going to continue with this organization, or are we going to be changing it? Because I have heard they are not the greatest one to be doing business with.
I have not heard that. I'm not aware of any intention to change vendors at this time, but if anything would change, we would bring that to the board.
Thank
I
you.
believe we're in a multi-year commitment, closer to 10 years than 5. 9-year contract. Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. A follow-up by Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Butita. Actually, you sparked a good question there. I would assume that IT has asset tags on all of those radios?
Carla?
Yeah, there was a list when this was approved late in 2016 before I arrived of where the radios were going to be.
Right. No, my point is, though, that, organizations usually tag each electronic device, from laptops through radios, et cetera, with a unique identifier so they can easily be tracked. This has been standard IT practice for 20 years. I would assume that those devices have IT tags on them, and that there is a master list of actually who is assigned to that. If you could identify if that list does exist, and report back to us and share if possible. That way we know exactly which radio is assigned to which individual. If we're not using asset tags, then I think we need to have another conversation.
Carla?
Thank you, Chairman. I believe the radios have an identifying number on them, so that's probably how they're tracking them.
Thank you for the follow-up. We'll confirm that. Any other questions or comments? Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to jump on this wagon, too, with the other agencies, other departments having these. I guess maybe less interested in who got them and more interested in are they using them, because it's a service we have to pay for monthly. So it's good to know who has them, but while you're asking the question, if you can also find out, are they using them and how many?
Very good question. Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Any other questions by board members on the Starcom budget amendment before the board? Seeing none, is that a hand up, Mr. Schultz? Oh, okay. Might have been a wave, I'm not sure. Are there any board members, the wave. Are there any board members opposed to this motion? Please raise your hand. We have Mr. Fellers, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Fiducia, and Mrs. Crosby are no votes, as well as Mrs. Gorel. All other board members, I'm going to cast a yes vote for, and the motion passes. Thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you, Mr. Salgado.
Yes, final thing, at the last Finance Committee, Carla and the staff presented the capital plan, the 2-year. There was good discussion on that. More to come in the next week, I believe. We're going to have some sort of meeting, whether it's with finance, kind of talk about the options we have when it comes to funding this $30 million capital plan that we're doing, and potentially doing a 5-year versus a 2-year. I know Mr. Fellers brought up if we could get a master list of all the items out there, so we're going to take a good stab at it. I want to give thanks to Carla for doing this, because this is something we need to plan for the future. It's a good attempt to figure out where we're going to get the funds. Good discussions. Obviously, we don't have all the answers, but it's a good starting point where we can move forward on that. So with that, hopefully there'll be notices going out for next week's meeting. So thank you. That's all I got.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. And our next item of business, Zoning Committee.
Okay, thank you. Your zoning committee has 2 items to be voted on this evening. The first is SU 0119. That's a special use permit for an outdoor entertainment. And this is in County Board District 4. And this came from Zoning Board of Appeals, kind of in a strange fashion. The motion to approve at ZBA failed 3-1, and it was due to the fact that it's an odd vote count on that. 3-1, you would think that would, prevail, but due to our ordinance, it takes 4 to approve something. At any rate, it moved forward to the zoning committee, and we approved it at zoning committee 5-1. And I would move to approve this with conditions.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster on SU 0119, special use permit for outdoor entertainment. I got a second I got a bunch of hands up. Bear with me. Mr. Kelly, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Fellers, Mr. Boomer, Mr. Girl. The item is now before the board. Any discussion on SU 0119, special use for outdoor entertainment? Yes, sir, Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what exactly is the entertainment? What is the event that's happening?
Mr. Webster?
It's, let me think, the best way to describe it to you would be, it's pretty low-key. They have a trio of musicians that has periodic outdoor activities at a winery. So the winery has weddings and so forth like that, and so it's, if you would imagine it at a winery, it's kind of the ambiance thing,
And the conditions you mentioned are just that they are not disruptive?
Well, I wouldn't think they were. The conditions, there was 19 conditions on there.
Oh, okay. That's fine. It's in there?
I could
All
read
right.
them if you like.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. I believe the next person up is Mr. Fellers. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Arena, I'd happy to provide some clarification on this if you'd like. The special use allows for outdoor. I believe that it ends by 7 o'clock. They are only allowed to use a single amplifier to cut down on the noise, as well as for outside. There's no limit on the number of musicians, but the amplification and the time limit keeps it all within reason during those summer hours.
Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Any other questions or comments by board members on SU 0119? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Are there any opposed? Mr. Schultz on the no vote. All other board members, the other 18, are a yes vote. Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. Webster.
Okay, thank you. The second final item on there is an ordinance amending the Unified Development Ordinance to address vacation rentals. And this was requested by Prosser Management, and this is a county-wide ordinance, so it affects the entire county. Okay, so Zoning Board of Appeals approved this unanimously, as did the Zoning Committee, and I would move to approve.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster on the ordinance amending the UDO to address vacation rentals. May I have a second? Mr. Kelly, Mr. Westcott, Mr. Fellers, Mr. Boomer, Mrs. Gorel. The item is now before the board. Again, the ordinance on the UDO to address vacation rentals. I'll go to Mr. Fellers first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief comment on this. These, short-term vacation rentals, often referred to as Airbnbs, if you're familiar with the online booking site. Honestly, this is a very progressive UDO change for this county. We're probably in the top 0.01% of counties nationally that have actually addressed this issue. And I think this is a great thing for us, as it allows these short-term rentals to take place and allows for our residents to find additional sources of income. Thank you.
If I may,
Mr. Webster.
the main difference between this and an Airbnb is if it's a B&B, that's bread and breakfast. So you would have to supply a breakfast to them. With a vacation rental, you are allowed to rent your home at short-term, fully equipped, okay, without providing breakfast. They're on their own.
Breakfast optional.
That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this only applies to unincorporated areas of the county?
Yes, correct.
Right, and what type of regulation do we have regarding disruptions that occur with these types of situations? So a bunch of college guys get together and decide they're going to have a bachelor party and, a vacation rental that they book online with, there's a whole bunch of different sites. Do we have some way to control it if someone's property becomes a nuisance?
I would have to say this. As far as the disruption goes, breaking the law, you'd have the same rights to call the cops, to have them break up the bar party or whoever the heck it is there. As far as tearing the property up, being liable for damages, that would be like it is in your own home. You have insurance, and you have to take care of that yourself.
I'm thinking more in terms of ongoing problems. So if we have a person who purchases property
Yes.
that might be appealing for, weekends and stuff, and that property starts to become detrimental to the neighbors, does the county have some type of nuisance abatement ordinance or something that we could intervene with?
Mr. Schultz wants to answer that?
Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't speak to I don't think we have a noise ordinance
No.
In the county, but
No.
when you look at the provision that we have in our packet, it mentions that this is only in limited locations that it will be available, and it will be available as a special use. And so that means that whoever wants to take advantage of this change will still have to come in for a special use, and that has a process that comes through our zoning. And typically there are conditions that are applied to special uses, and so there will be opportunity for there to be safeguards built into the special uses as they're approved, and then also evaluated after the fact.
Thank you, that's what I wanted to hear.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Thank you, Mr. Arena. Is there anything staff would like to add to this portion of the discussion? Did we cover it? Covered it. Thank you for the thumbs up, Troy. It means we're in good shape. Any other discussion or questions by board members? Seeing none, again, the ordinance is the UDO to address vacation rentals. Are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Please raise your hand. Seeing none, I'm going to ask the clerk to cast a yes vote for all 19 members present, and the ordinance passes. Thank you very much for the discussion. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you, that's all we have. I have a zoning committee meeting coming up on the 27th. The only thing I do want to add is I want to thank Stephen Schultz for bringing that up to possibly new board members and maybe others. By state law, we don't have a noise ordinance in Winnebago County. Cities, municipalities can have noise ordinances, but the county, we're out of luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Next item of business, Economic Development Committee, Mr. Westcott.
Thank you, Chairman. I have no report, but I do want to mention a couple of things. This morning, Mr. Mike Dunn Jr. invited myself, Bert Girl, and let's see, who else was there? Oh, Jaime Salgado, to our one regional planning, and we had a great conversation with the mayor, Rail, Mayor Jury, and Mayor McNamara today, and that it was a pretty interesting afternoon. And also, later on this afternoon, we had another meeting with Nathan Bryant, myself, Bert Girl, and Jaime Salgado again. And I just want to thank both of them for allowing us to hear what they have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I know Mr. Bryant and I believe the RPC have helped with this working group with the policy development around the economic development items, so I want to thank them as well for their efforts. Thank you, Mr. Westcott. Next item of business, moving on, would be the Public Works Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have no report.
Next item of business, Public Safety Committee. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. The Public Safety Committee has one item, and that is a resolution authorizing execution of the intergovernmental cooperation agreement with the Forest Preserve of Winnebago County for police services, and I move for its adoption.
Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. We got a resolution authorizing execution of the intergovernmental cooperation agreement with the Forest Preserve of Winnebago County for police services. We have a second by Mr. Fellers, also by Mr. Butita and Mrs. Redd. Motion is second on the Forest Preserve police contract is now before the board. Any discussion on the Forest Preserve police contract that's coming back to us for the second time after a couple of administrative changes by the Forest Preserve staff, if I remember? Any other discussion, comments by board members? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. I would also like to thank board members, I think Mr. Butita, Mr. Arena, and Ms. Squirrel for attending. I could be wrong, Mr. Arena. Did you attend the conference to reduce recidivism in the county jail? That was, I'm so glad that more than one of us attended. I wish I could have attended, but I'd like to give thanks too for Marlana Doken for her part. She's with the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council that's associated with the Regional Planning Council, and the work that she's done. Also, I think everyone has in front of them a reminder that they have coming up a focused deterrence program under the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. There is a meeting coming up March 20th. It's next Wednesday night from 5:15 to 7:30. It says that you have to let her know before March 1st, but they may have openings. And one final item is I just want to recognize Deputy Keltner of the McHenry County Sheriff's Department for giving his life in public service, losing his life in Winnebago County. He has a wife and 2 children, and you know those children were very, very proud to have their father in law enforcement. So in your prayers, I just ask that you ask for God's grace, comforting his wife and children. Thank you. That concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Booker. Appreciate your remarks. Regarding the focus deterrence meeting Wednesday, I know the state's attorney, myself, and several others will be there. I would say over the next year or two, I'd ask every board member to consider attending one of these focus deterrence meetings. It's really fascinating and a short in and out 40-minute, 45-minute commitment. So if you have the time, make sure you RSVP to that. Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. Next item of business, Personnel and Policy Committee, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our Personnel and Policies Committee has one item in tonight, and that item is an ordinance amending sections of Chapter 2 of the Winnebago County Code. That's going to be Sections 2, and it's going to be the duties of the County Board Chairman. And we will be having a committee meeting, joint committee meeting March 21st. That'll be next Thursday. And at that meeting, I would invite all board members to attend that. And if you have any questions, I would respectfully request that you submit them in writing so we have the questions correct and we don't miss anything. And with that, we'd like to put that in for a first reading.
Just a procedural question. If we're laying over an item, we're bringing it to the board. When an item goes to the board to be read in, it is now the county board's item on the board floor that would lay over to the next meeting. So it cannot go in two directions at one time, procedurally speaking. So now that it has been voted out of committee, and my understanding is it was voted out of committee, an item cannot go left and right. It cannot go up and over, is my understanding. So if it's read in and laid over on the board floor, then how can it go back to committee unless there's I guess I don't understand that, Mr. Kurlinkus. Is that procedurally an appropriate move? Maybe it is. I've just never seen us do that before. Mr. Kurlinkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What they've done is voted on that at the committee. However, I think what they announced at the committee was because a number of members wanted to have more discussion on this. It is properly before the board, but that there's in my experience, there's no prohibition of simply discussing this more at the committee because, as we know, that any resolution or ordinance can be amended right up until the time that it's voted on by the county board.
A follow-up, Mr. Kurlinkus. So just so I understand, at the committee meeting, we could not amend the ordinance in the committee meeting. We would have to note any potential thoughts folks have, bring it back to the board in 2 weeks, and then amend it on this board floor since it's been laid over officially in the board floor. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Thank you very much. I see more hands up. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the light of that, since I was there for that discussion, it sounds like there are quite a few amendments that might need to be made to this ordinance. I would move that we suspend the rules and send it back to the Personnel and Policy Committee.
So we have a motion by Mr. Fellers to suspend the rules, which would, so we have a motion to suspend. Just a question is you got to do one step, two steps.
Allows you to suspend and pass. It also allows you to suspend and remit. It does. You can look it up.
So I'm going to go to our parliamentarian, Mr. Kurlinkus, and I'll just ask you to be patient with me for 1 minute. Mr. Kurlinkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been sent by the committee to the board. There's no action required on it. This is a first reading, so there's no, Mr. Fellers, there's no action required at this point.
I'm making a motion to suspend the rules.
There's no action pending before the board.
Yes, it is. It's been read in. We've done this. We do this every.
There's no action pending before the board.
So now if I may, now I'm confused. So could there be a motion to suspend the rules on this item?
Yes.
I'm just asking the simple step one question, and hold on, everybody, one at a time, please. I just want to make sure I understand the thinking of the state's attorney, of Mr. Kurlinkus, is there could be, if I understand you right, you could make a motion to suspend the rules. What you're saying, sir, is that you could not make a motion to suspend the rules and at the same time send it back to committee. You couldn't do the dual action. That's what you're suggesting. Is that correct?
There's nothing pending before the board this evening. There's nothing pending before the board. There's no question pending before the board to take any action on, which would require the suspension of the rules.
Follow up by Mr. Fellers.
Except that this passed out of committee with approval. It is in for a first reading. We do this all the time, where we suspend the rules so that we may take action on it today. I am asking that we take action on this today by suspending the rules, and I'm invoking Robert's Rules of Order to suspend and send back to committee as a dual motion. If it passes with a majority or supermajority vote, like any suspension of the rules, it would then go back to the Personnel and Policy Committee. If it doesn't, it would simply lay over like it would anyway. We do this every board meeting.
No, you don't.
Well, I think the distinction is that it's a dual, we suspend the rules almost every board meeting. What we do not do is suspend the rules and then take an action that would send something to committee. So since there is some disagreement, and since I would rather have there be clarity, do we want to make a motion to suspend the rules as a step one? If we suspend, then send back to committee, Mr. Fellers.
I withdraw my motion. Never mind.
So Mr. Fellers has withdrawn his question. Again, I just want to know for the record, the motion that was made was to suspend the rules and then refer to committee in one motion. That was by Mr. Kurlinkus, that it would not be an allowable action. I'll defer to him on that, and we'll move forward now. The item before the board that has been read in and laid over is the amendment to the ordinance amending sections Chapter 2 of the County Court of Ordinances defining the chairman's duty. It is laid over. Any discussion, Mr. Fiducia?
No, but we had 492 calls for service at Animal Services. We have 116 dogs, 68 cats, 7 bunnies. We have 64 dogs were adopted, 43 cats, and 4 of the bunnies got adopted out. That concludes my report.
Any unfinished business? Any new business? I thought we had new business here this evening. I guess we do not have new business here this evening. With that, I will go to Mr. Webster. Do we have any new business? I see none. We have a motion to adjourn by Mr. Webster. All those in favor, or a second by Mr. Westcott. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Have a good evening.